The Gilded Spoon was not a restaurant, it was a theater. Every evening, a new play unfolded upon its stage of starched white linen and gleaming mahogany. The actors were the city's elite, their costumes tailored suits and glittering evening gowns, their lines a murmur of stock prices and vacation plans in the south of France. The air, thick with the scent of truffle oil and old money, hummed with the low frequency of effortless power. In a quiet corner, almost lost in the deep shadows cast by a potted fern, sat an anomaly. Her name was Alara Vance, though no one in the room knew it, nor would they have reason to care. She was a spectator who had wandered onto the stage by mistake. Her costume was a simple heather gray sweater, soft with age, and a pair of faded jeans worn not for fashion but for comfort. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, unadorned ponytail. On her table sat a glass of water and a thick, dog-eared novel. She was a silent island of simplicity in an ocean of opulent display. The other diners, if they noticed her at all, saw her through a lens of swift, dismissive judgment. A woman in a navy blazer at a nearby table leaned toward her companion, her voice a sharp whisper that carried easily. One wonders how she even got a reservation, probably a walk-in they felt sorry for. Her friend giggled, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. Alara did not seem to hear. Her focus was absolute, her eyes tracing the lines of text in her book. There was a profound stillness about her, a quality that could be mistaken for timidity or social anxiety. But it was not the stillness of a mouse hiding from a cat. It was the stillness of a mountain, ancient and unconcerned with the fleeting weather patterns that played across its slopes. Her presence was a quiet defiance of the room's unspoken rules. She was alone, but she was not lonely. She was simple, but she was not insignificant. Into this carefully curated atmosphere swaggered Declan, Kyler, and Brogan. They were a trio of noise and arrogant energy, their laughter too loud, their gestures too broad. Declan, the self-appointed leader, wore a suit that was a shade too tight, a thick gold chain winking from beneath his collar. Kyler had a frat boy smirk permanently etched onto his face, and a buzz cut that did little to hide his belligerence. Brogan was the muscle tall, broad, with a flashy watch on his wrist that he checked far too often, as if his time were infinitely more valuable than anyone else's. They crashed into their table like a wave breaking on a placid shore, scattering the quiet with loud orders for beer and complaints about their workday. Then, Declan's eyes scanned the room, hungry for a diversion. They landed on Alara. He saw not a person, but a target. An easy mark. A woman alone, plainly dressed, absorbed in a book. To a man like Declan, this was an invitation. "Well, look what we have here," he said, his voice a low drawl meant for his friends but pitched for the room. "Little bookworm, all by herself." Kyler snickered, probably waiting for her Tinder date to stand her up. Brogan just grunted, his eyes lingering on Alara with a look of crude appraisal. Alara turned a page. The slight whisper of paper was the only acknowledgement she gave of their existence. This lack of reaction, this refusal to be intimidated, was not something they understood. It was a language they did not speak. And so, they decided they would have to shout until she was forced to listen. The first volley was a crude whistle from Declan, sharp and piercing. It cut through the gentle clinking of silverware, and heads turned. Laughter followed from their table, a harsh, braying sound. Ilara's posture did not change, but for a split second, the knuckles of the hand resting on her glass whitened before relaxing. She was aware. She was cataloging. They left their own table, a mess of crumpled napkins and half-empty glasses, and began to circle hers, like predators closing in. "Hey, sweetheart," Kyler leaned in, his breath a foul mix of beer and overconfidence. "You look lonely. Why don't you come sit with us? We'll show you a good time." The words were coded in mockery. The woman in the navy blazer watched with a pursed-lip disapproval directed not at the men, but at Alara. "Look at her, just sitting there," she whispered to her friend. "She's practically inviting it by not responding. Some people just love the drama." Alara slowly closed her book, marking her page with a deliberate press of her thumb. She set it beside her plate of untouched pasta, the steam still curling from it like a silent, ghostly question. She lifted her eyes from her book for the first time, and they were the color of a forest floor in winter deep, green, and cold. A young waiter, barely out of his teens, approached nervously. His hands trembled slightly as he held his tray. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" he whispered, his gaze darting toward the three men. Before Alara could answer, Declan waved a dismissive hand. "Mind your business, kid. The lady and us are just getting acquainted." The boy flinched. His tray wobbled, and a glass of red wine tipped, splashing a violent crimson stain across the pristine white tablecloth and the polished floor. The men roared with laughter. The waiter's face burned with humiliation as he scrambled for a cloth, his hands shaking even more now. The room watched, some with pity for the boy, some with amusement, but most with a detached curiosity, as if this were all part of the evening's entertainment. Then, Alara did something unexpected. She didn't speak to her harassers. She didn't call for the manager. She slid her own clean, folded napkin across the table toward the mortified waiter. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and her voice was low but steady, cutting through the laughter. "It's all right. You're fine." It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, but in that moment, she had chosen her side. She had allied herself with the nervous, invisible boy against the loud, powerful men. The waiter gave her a quick, grateful nod, his panic receding slightly as he took the napkin. But this act of quiet kindness only seemed to egg the men on. To them, her concern for a mere waiter was further proof of her lowly status. Declan slammed his heavy beer glass down on her table, the thud echoing in the suddenly tense room. "Come on, drink with us," he demanded, his smirk widening. "What, you too good for us?" The entire restaurant seemed to lean in, waiting. This was the moment she was supposed to shrink, to stammer an apology, to grab her bag and flee. But Alara Vance did none of those things. She simply lifted her gaze from the waiter and fixed it on Declan. "I'll say this once," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "Leave me alone." The words were not a plea. They were a statement of fact, a boundary drawn in steel. For a moment, Declan was taken aback by her tone, but his ego quickly reasserted itself. Kyler let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Ooh, she's got some fire in her. I like that." The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted from drama to danger. The diners were no longer amused. A palpable tension crackled in the air. The manager, a wiry man with a permanently stressed expression, hovered near the bar, wringing his hands but doing nothing. He weighed the cost of intervening against a table of wealthy, loud patrons versus the potential complaint from a lone, plainly dressed woman. The calculation was, as it so often is, a cowardly one. Brogan, who had been silent until now, decided it was time for the muscle to act. He saw her composure not as strength, but as an insult. He sauntered behind her chair, his heavy steps a drumbeat of impending violation. "You heard my friend," he growled, his voice a low rumble, and then he made the final, irrevocable mistake. He slapped his heavy hand down on her shoulder. It was not a gentle touch. It was a gesture of ownership, of dominance. The crack of his palm against the soft wool of her sweater was sharp and ugly. A woman at a nearby table gasped, clutching her wineglass. The young waiter froze, his eyes wide with horror. The world seemed to slow down. In that instant of contact, a circuit was completed. A line was crossed. What happened next was a blur of fluid, economical motion. It was so fast, so precise, that the eyes of the onlookers could barely register it. Before Brogan could even tighten his grip, Alara's hand shot up and clamped around his wrist. It was not a slap or a push, it was a capture. Her fingers found the precise nerve clusters. With a twist that seemed to defy physics, she used his own weight and momentum against him, bending his wrist back at an impossible angle. A howl of pure, unadulterated pain ripped from Brogan's throat as he crashed to his knees, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. The room fell silent. Forks clattered against plates. She didn't stop. In a single, seamless movement, she was on her feet, kicking her chair aside. The other two, Declan and Kyler, were lunging forward, their expressions a mixture of shock and fury. They were too slow. They were moving through water while she moved through air. A swift, brutal jab of her knuckles caught Declan square on the jaw. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled sideways, dazed. Simultaneously, a perfectly placed kick found Kyler's solar plexus. The air whooshed out of his lungs in a sickening gasp, and he doubled over, clutching his stomach, unable to breathe. It was over in less than 15 seconds. 3 grown men, all larger and heavier than her, were sprawled on the floor, incapacitated. Alara stood in the small space she had cleared, breathing evenly. Her sweater was slightly askew. A single strand of hair had escaped her ponytail. Otherwise, she was utterly calm, her face a neutral mask, as if she had just completed a routine, slightly boring task. She looked down at the wreckage of the men at her feet, then slowly, deliberately, sat back down at her table. She picked up her fork and nudged a piece of pasta, the steam still rising around it. The play in the Gilded Spoon had a new, unexpected protagonist, and no one in the audience knew what to do. The silence that followed was a physical entity, heavy and suffocating. It was broken by a man in a pinstriped suit, his face red with indignation, who shot up from his table. "This is outrageous," he boomed, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. "This is a civilized establishment. You can't just attack people like this. Someone call the police." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The narrative in their minds was already being written. A hysterical, violent woman had assaulted 3 patrons. They had seen what happened, but they could not process it. It did not fit their understanding of the world. A woman who looked like Alara was supposed to be a victim, not a victor. Ilara's eyes flicked toward the man for a single, cold second. She didn't speak, but her gaze was so steady, so utterly unimpressed by his blustering, that he faltered. His words trailed off, and he sat back down, suddenly unsure of himself. The 3 men began to stir. Brogan cradled his wrist, whimpering. Declan spat out a curse, rubbing his jaw. Kyler was still on his knees, gasping for breath. The humiliation was a poison spreading through their veins, rapidly turning to rage. "Just a lucky shot," a man with slicked back hair scoffed from his table, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Once they get up, she's finished." The consensus in the room seemed to agree. This had been a fluke, a desperate act of self-defense that had somehow worked. Now, reality would reassert itself. Brogan staggered to his feet, his face crimson. "You bitch," he seethed, taking a clumsy step toward her. His friends wobbled upright behind him, their bravado shattered but their pride demanding retribution. The room held its breath. The manager was finally on the phone, his voice a frantic whisper, calling for security. Everyone expected Ilara to finally show fear, to grab her bag and run. She did not. Instead, she placed her fork neatly on her plate and calmly, methodically, rolled up the sleeve of her gray sweater. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, but what it revealed silenced the room once more. On the toned muscle of her forearm was a tattoo. It was not a flower or a butterfly. It was the United States Navy SEAL trident, an anchor, an eagle, and a pistol, sharp and unmistakable. A few gasps broke the silence. In the corner, an older man with a military-style crew cut leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in recognition. "My God," he muttered to his companion, "that's a trident." And the whisper spread like wildfire. "Special Ops, Navy SEAL." The words were incredible, impossible. The 3 men froze. The color drained from their faces. The rage was instantly replaced by a dawning, sickening dread. They knew what that symbol meant. They knew they had not just harassed a woman. They had provoked something far, far more dangerous. Brogan's hands began to shake as he took a step back. Alara didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The symbol spoke for her. She rose from her chair again, not with the explosive speed of before, but with a deliberate, lethal grace. The men saw her coming, but they were paralyzed by the horrifying new context. This time, it was not a defense. It was a conclusion. In 10 seconds, all 3 were back on the floor, neutralized with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. One with his arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold, another curled into a ball, groaning, the third flat on his back, staring blankly at the ornate ceiling, the fight completely gone from him. The restaurant was now a vacuum. Sound, movement, even breath seemed to have been sucked out of the room. A busboy stood frozen by the kitchen door, a tray of dirty dishes clutched in his white-knuckled hands, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The diners stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the quiet woman in the faded jeans with the warrior who had just dismantled 3 men with the ease of a master craftsman disassembling a piece of furniture. "It's a stunt." A woman in a glittering red dress hissed, her voice sharp with disdain. "It has to be. What is this? A movie set?" The slick-haired businessman nodded in agreement. "If you're really a SEAL, why are you here?" he called out, his tone challenging, desperate to find a lie that would restore his sense of order. Just as security burst through the main doors, two burly men in black polo shirts, looking bewildered, another figure entered behind them, cutting through the chaos like a knife. He was an older man, perhaps in his 50s, wearing a simple but perfectly tailored black suit. He had a jaw like granite and eyes that seemed to take in the entire scene in a single, sweeping glance. He moved with an aura of absolute authority that made the restaurant's security guards look like amateurs. "Stand down," he said to the guards. His voice was not loud, but it carried a command that was instantly obeyed. He walked past them, his gaze falling on the three pathetic figures on the floor, then lifting to meet Alara's. He approached her, and the room watched, breathless. He stopped a few feet from her, flashed a discreet ID from his jacket. The seal of the United States Naval Special Warfare Command glinted under the chandelier lights, and then, to the utter astonishment of everyone present, he bowed his head slightly. His voice was soft, but in the dead silence, every word was clear. "My apologies, Commander Vance. I wasn't aware you were in the city. We would have provided a security detail." "Commander." The word dropped into the room like a bomb. Not an officer, not a soldier, a commander, a leader of the most elite fighting force in the world. The slick-haired businessman's jaw dropped. The woman in the red dress choked on a sip of wine. The pinstriped man who had called Alara a danger seemed to shrink in his chair. Alara just gave the man a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her face was unreadable. This was not a moment of triumph for her. It was an interruption, a complication to her quiet evening. The man in the suit, Agent Thorne, turned his gaze from Alara to the rest of the room. His eyes were like chips of ice. "This incident is now a matter of national security," he stated calmly. The implication was clear. What had happened here was no longer a simple bar fight. It was the harassment of a high-ranking, active-duty special operations officer. The reality of their misjudgment crashed down upon the diners with the force of a physical blow. They had not just witnessed a woman defend herself. They had witnessed a lioness, patiently enduring the yapping of hyenas, before finally deciding she'd had enough. And they, the spectators, had judged the lioness for having claws. The shift in the room was instantaneous and absolute. Fear and shock morphed into a profound, chilling reverence. Declan, still on the floor, began to sob. "We didn't know," he blubbered, his voice muffled against the expensive carpet. "Oh God, we didn't know. Please, forgive us." Kyler was openly crying, his tough guy facade dissolving into pathetic, hiccuping tears. Brogan just lay there, staring at the ceiling as if his entire world had collapsed in on him. Agent Thorne gave a curt nod. "Get them out of here," he said to the security guards, who now moved with a new, nervous urgency to haul the three men to their feet. Then, Thorne raised a hand slightly. From 5 different tables scattered around the Gilded Spoon, 5 men stood up in unison. They were of different ages and builds. One was a young man who looked like a college student, another a middle-aged man with a scarred cheek, but they all moved with the same quiet, coiled intensity. They had been there all along, invisible, blending in. Her detail, watching. They faced Alara, and as one, their movements crisp and practiced, they saluted. "Commander," the man with the scar said, his voice ringing with respect. "Your orders." The air in the room solidified. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. This was no longer a restaurant. It was a command post. Alara looked at her men, and for the first time, a flicker of warmth, of camaraderie, softened her expression. She gave them a small, dismissive wave. "Continue your meal," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm finished here." And they nodded, saluted again, and sat down as seamlessly as they had risen, melting back into the background. Just as the security guards were leading the now cuffed and utterly broken men toward the door, another man walked in. He was tall, with broad shoulders, dressed in a simple, well-fitting suit that spoke of quality without needing to shout. He didn't look around at the scene of chaos. His eyes went straight to Alara. He walked to her table, his steps measured and calm. The remaining tension in the room seemed to dissolve in his presence. He leaned down and whispered something in her ear, something too quiet for anyone else to hear. A small, genuine smile finally touched Alara's lips. She nodded, closed her book with a soft snap, and stood. He was her husband, Liam. He He wasn't there to save her. He was there to go home with her. His presence wasn't a display of power, but of partnership. He placed a gentle hand on the small of her back, a simple, grounding gesture. As Alara and Liam walked toward the exit, the entire restaurant watched in silence. It was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of awe. They had misjudged her clothes, her solitude, her gender. They had misjudged everything. A woman in her 40s, who had been sitting alone all night looking exhausted and sad, met Alara's eyes as she passed. The woman gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement from one woman who knew the weight of silent battles to another. Alara paused for a fraction of a second and returned the nod, a quiet moment of understanding that no one else saw. They left the Gilded Spoon, leaving behind a room full of chastened, humbled people and the lingering, undeniable truth of who Alara Vance truly was. The consequences arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable logic of a world that, sometimes, finds a way to balance its scales. Declan, a mid-level executive at a tech firm, discovered the next morning that his access cards no longer worked. His LinkedIn profile vanished. There was no press release, no dramatic firing, just a silent digital erasure. Kyler, a real estate agent who flaunted his commissions on Instagram, received a one-line email from his largest client, a developer who did not appreciate the optics of being associated with someone who harassed a decorated naval officer. The deal, worth millions, was gone. Brogan tried to spin the story. He posted a rambling, tearful apology video that only made things worse. The comments were a digital firestorm of vitriol. His lucrative sponsorship deal with a fitness brand was terminated overnight via a public tweet. Their ruin was as swift and efficient as the takedown that had preceded it. Alara saw none of it. She was already miles away, the city lights flashing across the windshield as Liam drove. They didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't need to. He simply reached over and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. She squeezed back. It was all that needed to be said. They didn't go home. Instead, they pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the kind with sticky tables, cracked vinyl booths, and coffee that tasted like burnt toast. It was a world away from the Gilded Spoon. It was real. She ordered a cheeseburger and fries. He got pancakes. They ate in a comfortable silence, the hum of the old jukebox filling the space between them. For a moment, Alara's mind drifted back. She was 22 again, on a dusty base in a desert whose name she was forbidden to speak. The air was so hot it felt like breathing sand. She was the only woman in her unit, the weight of her gear a constant, crushing companion. A young soldier from Texas had handed her a bottle of water one night, the stars overhead looking like chips of shattered diamond. "You're tougher than all of us combined, Vance," he'd said, half joking, half serious. She had smiled, a rare, genuine smile, and kept moving. That was her life. Keep moving. Keep steady. Back in the diner, she pushed her plate away, her burger half-eaten. Liam looked at her, his eyes soft but searching. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, her fingers tracing the condensation on her water glass. "Always," she said. The word carried the weight of a promise she had made to herself long ago, in deserts and jungles, in places of unimaginable hardship. They paid the bill, left a generous tip for the weary waitress, and stepped back out into the cool night air. The city buzzed around them, indifferent and anonymous. The incident at the restaurant would become a story, a whispered legend among those who were there. The businessman would think twice before judging a stranger. The woman in the red dress would delete her snarky social media posts when the backlash began. The veterans in the room would tell the tale with quiet pride in VFW halls. But Alara Vance needed none of it. She didn't need their apologies, their fear, or their awe. She had spent a lifetime proving herself, not to them, but to the determined young woman she saw in the mirror each morning. The world could judge her clothes, her silence, her solitude. It could throw its assumptions and its prejudices at her like stones, but it could never touch her core. She walked on beside her husband, her steps steady and sure, melting back into the anonymity of the crowd. She was a warrior hidden in plain sight, her strength, not a weapon to be brandished, but a quiet, unshakable truth, echoing in the stillness of the night.